What if the smoke choking your lungs right now started from a fire you will never see, in a forest you will never visit, hundreds of miles from where you're standing? That question stopped being hypothetical this July when Canada's biggest city woke up to air worse than anywhere else on Earth. Before we go further, if disasters told through real numbers instead of panic headlines matter to you, tap that subscribe button right now. Not because I'm asking nicely, but because this channel exists to cut through noise. And you deserve to know that before you invest the next few minutes in me. Let's set the scene properly, because the surface story is dramatic enough on its own, but the real story underneath it is stranger and more unsettling than most people realize. In mid-July 2026, Toronto, a city of roughly 3 million people, recorded the single worst air quality of any major city on the planet. Not New Delhi, not Kinshasa, not Doha, Toronto. A city known for lakeside parks, glass towers, and clean summer mornings, suddenly sat under an orange sky so thick that outdoor pools shut down, summer camps moved indoors, and doctors braced for a spike in emergency room visits. The source of that smoke wasn't some catastrophic blaze tearing through the city's outskirts. It was burning more than 100 miles away, deep inside a stretch of forest in northwestern Ontario that almost nobody in Toronto has ever set foot in and never will. That single fact should already feel strange to you. A forest fire, invisible to the people it's hurting the most, somehow became the defining health emergency of their week. And that strangeness is exactly where this story gets interesting. Because what's happening in Canada right now isn't just about fire. It's about how disaster travels, who actually pays the price for it, and why a season that looks calm on paper can still turn into a nightmare within days. Here is where the numbers get genuinely surprising. According to Canada's own official wildfire tracking, released on July 9th, 2026, there were 796 active wildfires burning across the country at that moment. 60 of them were serious enough to be classified as out of control, meaning full firefighting crews were assigned and still couldn't contain them. Since January, Canada had logged just over 3,100 individual fires, burning through roughly 1.4 million hectares of land, an area bigger than the entire country of Jamaica. Read those numbers on their own, and 2026 already sounds like a brutal year. But here's the twist nobody expects. Compare this season to the exact same point in 2025, and Canada had actually recorded fewer individual fires last year, just under 2,900. Yet those fires had already burned through 4.6 million hectares, more than 3 times what has burned so far in 2026. By the measurement scientists actually use to rank how serious a wildfire season really is, total land burned, this year is technically running below average. Quieter than last year, quieter than the 5-year norm. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it's the single most important thing to understand about everything happening in Canada right now. A below-average season still managed to give Toronto the worst air on the planet. It still triggered evacuations across multiple provinces. It still pushed thick, dangerous smoke across an international border into major American cities within the same week. If quiet looks like this, then the real question isn't whether this season is bad. It's what happens if it stops being quiet at all. And based on what forecasters are already saying about the rest of the summer, that shift might already be underway. Let's talk about why total fires and total area burned tell 2 completely different stories, because this distinction matters more than it sounds. Imagine one season with 1,000 small fires, most of them caught early, contained fast, and never allowed to spread. Now imagine a different season with slightly fewer fires, but a handful of them explode into massive, fast-moving infernos that burn for weeks. The second season will always look worse on the ground, even with a lower fire count, because size and speed matter far more than sheer numbers. That's exactly the gap between 2025 and 2026. More fires this year, but smaller ones, at least so far. It's the reason officials keep pointing to area burned instead of raw fire counts. It's the more honest number, and it's the number that currently gives this season a deceptive calm. Now, picture the actual week that just happened in Toronto, because the details matter here. On July 15th and 16th, smoke from more than 100 active wildfires in northwestern Ontario rolled south and swallowed the city overnight. Environment Canada issued an air quality warning as the haze thickened. By the next morning, the city's skyline had vanished behind an orange fog so dense that visibility dropped noticeably at street level. According to the Swiss air monitoring company IQ, Toronto's air quality that morning was officially the worst of any major city in the world, worse than cities that deal with severe pollution as a permanent condition of daily life. The city shut down outdoor pools, summer camps for children were pulled indoors or canceled entirely. Environment Canada's Air Quality Health Index climbed to a reading of 10 or higher, the agency's own threshold for what it calls very high risk, a level where officials warn that the air is dangerous for everyone, regardless of age or health status. The next day brought only slight relief. Toronto dropped from worst air on the planet to third worst. The orange alert stayed active. Pools stayed closed for a second straight day. Local forecasters warned residents that even as conditions slowly improved, lingering smoke could still cause eye and throat irritation, headaches, and mild coughing, with anyone experiencing wheezing or chest pain urged to seek medical attention immediately. And here's what made the week even harder for the people living through it. This wasn't just a smoke event. It arrived directly on top of an active heat dome already baking the region, stretching from Saskatchewan through Manitoba, across nearly all of Ontario and into Quebec. Toronto hit 33 degrees Celsius that day, feeling closer to 36 once humidity was factored in. Two separate hazards, heat and smoke, colliding in the exact same city on the exact same days. I'll come back to why that combination is more dangerous than either threat on its own, because it creates an almost impossible choice for the people most at risk. The smoke didn't respect any border either. Within days, it drifted south into the United States, and 3 major American cities, including Chicago, found themselves ranked among the worst air quality readings anywhere on Earth. Agencies across the American Midwest and Northeast issued their own warnings, as forecasters cautioned that millions more people could face unhealthy air in the days ahead. This isn't a one-off anomaly, it's become a pattern. Canadian wildfire smoke crossing into the United States and, in some years, reaching all the way across the Atlantic into Europe, has now shown up repeatedly across recent fire seasons. 2026 is simply the latest chapter. It's worth understanding why smoke behaves this way, because it explains something genuinely counterintuitive. A wildfire itself stays confined to the ground it's actually burning, but once that fire generates enough heat, the smoke rises high into the atmosphere and gets picked up by upper-level wind currents, the same kind of winds that move weather systems across entire continents. Once smoke reaches that altitude, it can travel thousands of kilometers in just a few days, crossing provinces, countries, even oceans, while the fire that produced it never moves an inch. That's the reason a blaze deep in a nearly empty stretch of Ontario forest can directly shape the health warnings, closed pools and cancelled summer camps of a city 3 million people call home, a city that will never see a single flame from the fire actually responsible. If you're the kind of viewer who wants to understand exactly how something happening hundreds of miles away can rewrite your own day, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. It genuinely helps me see how far this story is actually reaching. And honestly, it's one of the more interesting parts of doing this job, seeing just how widely this smoke and this story actually travels. Now let's get precise about where this particular round of smoke actually came from, because the location tells its own story. Roughly 148 active wildfires were burning across northwestern Ontario in mid-July, a remote stretch of dense boreal forest with very few roads and even fewer towns. Several of those fires forced evacuation orders for First Nations communities in the region, communities that in many cases have no road access whatsoever and rely entirely on aircraft to get people out when a fire closes in. As of July 17, 2026, 21 First Nations communities across the country had been affected by wildfires this season. 13 of them had been formally evacuated, and roughly 2,182 people were displaced from their homes as a direct result. Ontario carried the largest share of that burden, with 7 of its First Nations communities among those evacuated, while British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces each carried a smaller piece of the remaining impact. This is worth sitting with because it reveals something uncomfortable about how unevenly this disaster actually lands on people. For most residents in Toronto or Chicago, this wildfire season means a hazy sky, a warning notification on their phone, and a day or two spent indoors before life returns to normal. It's disruptive, even genuinely unhealthy in the short term, but it passes. For a much smaller number of people, many of them in remote, often Indigenous communities, sitting directly in these fires' paths, this same season means something entirely different. It means a sudden evacuation by aircraft, no idea when or if they'll be allowed to return, and an anxious wait to learn whether their home is even still standing. Same wildfire season, same headline. 2 almost unrecognizable experiences. This gap isn't new, and to their credit, Canadian officials have acknowledged it directly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Recent funding tied to this year's wildfire season has gone toward projects with Métis and First Nations governments across British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, aimed at improving wildfire risk mapping, emergency planning, and evacuation coordination that actually incorporates Indigenous knowledge of the land rather than treating these communities as an afterthought once a fire is already raging. Additional funding has gone toward training dozens of new Indigenous wildland firefighters, building local capacity directly inside the communities most frequently and most severely hit, instead of relying entirely on crews flown in from elsewhere once a fire has already grown dangerous. It's also worth being honest about something that often gets misunderstood. When officials label a fire out of control, that doesn't automatically mean firefighters have given up or that nobody is paying attention. In many cases, it simply means the fire is burning in terrain with no roads, no accessible water source, and no safe way to land equipment or crews. That forces fire agencies into genuine triage. Resources go toward defending the fires that directly threaten towns and human lives, while fires burning through genuinely empty backcountry are often simply monitored because there is no safe or practical way to fight them at all. In those cases, only a real change in weather, cooler air, higher humidity, meaningful rainfall will actually slow them down. So when the government reports 60 fires currently receiving full response and still classified as out of control, that number reflects the fires serious and accessible enough to justify committing real firefighting resources. Not every single fire currently burning across the country. Fire and smoke aren't the only emergency unfolding in Canada right now either, and this part tends to get lost in a story that's otherwise entirely about flame and haze. Manitoba, particularly the Parkland region, has been dealing with intense storms and heavy rainfall in recent weeks. Serious enough that the federal government approved a formal request for emergency flooding assistance from the province in early July 2026. That means some of the same provinces currently battling wildfire smoke and evacuations are simultaneously managing a completely separate flooding crisis. A genuinely difficult season rarely shows up as just one type of disaster. It tends to arrive from multiple directions at once. Let's talk about the actual danger hiding inside that smoke, because the part that hurts you most isn't the part you can see or smell. The specific pollutant that matters here is called PM2.5, fine particulate matter, roughly 2.5 micrometers across or smaller, about 1/30th the width of a single human hair. These microscopic particles make up around 90% of the total particle mass a wildfire releases into the air, and their size is exactly what makes them so dangerous. Your body has natural defenses against larger dust and debris. Your nose and throat filter out bigger particles before they ever reach anywhere important. But particles this small slip straight past those defenses entirely. They travel deep into the smallest airways of your lungs, and from there, directly into your bloodstream. That's the entire reason a faint, barely visible haze outside your window is a real physiological event, not just a mild inconvenience. Short-term exposure can trigger asthma attacks, acute bronchitis, eye and throat irritation, and a meaningfully higher risk of respiratory infection. For people with existing heart or lung conditions, it can push an already strained system past a genuinely dangerous threshold. Health researchers have documented measurable spikes in emergency room visits and hospital admissions in the days immediately following events exactly like this one. Here's a stop and think moment for you. If this kind of breakdown of how wildfire smoke actually affects your body is useful, share this video with one person you know who lives somewhere smoke has touched this year. Not because sharing grows a channel, though it does, but because most people genuinely don't know this information, and it might change how seriously they take the next orange sky warning that pops up on their phone. There's growing research suggesting wildfire smoke may actually be more harmful, particle for particle, than the everyday pollution most city dwellers are used to breathing from cars and industrial sources. Some studies tracking hospital admissions have found respiratory cases rising somewhere between roughly 1 and 10% for every additional 10 micrograms per cubic meter of wildfire-specific particulate matter in the air, a notably steeper increase than the same concentration of typical urban pollution tends to produce. One proposed explanation involves the specific chemistry of wildfire smoke itself, which appears to generate more free radicals once inhaled, driving greater inflammation and oxidative stress in lung tissue compared to more familiar sources of city pollution. In plain terms, the exact same numerical air quality reading can carry a noticeably higher real-world health risk when it comes from wildfire smoke instead of ordinary traffic pollution. On a calm summer day, that's precisely why health agencies tend to issue especially urgent warnings, specifically during wildfire smoke events, rather than treating every kind of poor air quality the same way. It's also worth gently correcting a common assumption a lot of people make without even realizing it. Many assume that if they can't smell smoke, the air outside must be safe, and that once the smell fades, the danger is past too. Neither of those assumptions holds up. The smallest, most damaging particles don't always announce themselves through smell, which is exactly why health agencies consistently advise people to check an actual air quality reading rather than trust their own nose. A day that looks like nothing more than a pale, ordinary haze can still be carrying more than enough fine particulate matter to send genuinely vulnerable people to the hospital. Now here's the part that made this particular week in Toronto so uniquely difficult, and it's a detail most coverage completely skips over. During a heat wave on its own, standard advice is to open your windows at night and let air circulate to help cool your home down. During a smoke event on its own, The advice is essentially the opposite. Seal up your house, keep windows and doors shut, run your air conditioning on a recirculating setting to keep outside air out entirely. When a heat dome and a wildfire smoke event hit the exact same region at the exact same time, as happened across southern Ontario this past week, the same vulnerable people facing both warnings are left with two pieces of advice that directly contradict each other. An elderly resident without reliable air conditioning, choosing between a stifling sealed apartment and an open window that lets smoke pour in, is facing a genuinely impossible situation, and there is no clean answer. Health officials handling this exact overlap have generally leaned toward prioritizing whichever risk feels more immediately dangerous in the moment, which in practice usually means keeping windows shut and running air conditioning where it's available, since heat exhaustion tends to develop more slowly and is somewhat easier to manage through hydration in cooling centers than the sharp, immediate respiratory strain caused by heavy smoke inhalation. Cities dealing with this overlap, Toronto very much included this past week, opened designated cooling centers built specifically to offer relief from both hazards at once. Air-conditioned indoor spaces with filtered air, giving residents without adequate cooling or filtration at home somewhere safer to wait out the worst hours of a combined heat and smoke emergency. This exact overlap, extreme heat arriving together with heavy wildfire smoke, has quietly become a defining feature of recent Canadian and American summers, rather than a rare coincidence worth dismissing. Now let's address something directly, because it deserves a clear, honest answer instead of being ignored. Every serious wildfire season now brings along a wave of online claims suggesting these fires were started deliberately, sometimes framed as a coordinated campaign, and in stranger corners of the internet, framed around some kind of exotic weapon. The honest answer separates a small grain of truth from a much larger fantasy. Individual fires do sometimes have human causes. Arson is a real documented phenomenon in isolated cases. But a continent-scale wildfire season involving hundreds of simultaneous ignitions spread across thousands of kilometers of largely roadless northern forest simply isn't something any person or small group could realistically produce. The real drivers here are lightning strikes, extremely dry fuel built up from prolonged drought, and strong shifting winds. The ordinary, well-understood physics of hot, parched terrain meeting an ignition source. There's no credible evidence of any exotic or deliberate mechanism behind this season. Frankly, none is needed to explain what sustained heat and dryness are already fully capable of doing entirely on their own. It's worth understanding why this kind of claim resurfaces so reliably every single fire season, no matter which country it's happening in. Picturing hundreds of fires burning simultaneously across a vast, largely empty stretch of forest is genuinely hard for most people. Because very few of us have ever watched lightning ignite dry brush firsthand, or seen just how fast bone-dry vegetation can catch and spread under the right combination of heat, wind, and drought. That gap between lived experience and the actual physical scale of a boreal forest fire season creates fertile ground for alternative explanations to take root, even when the real, scientifically documented cause, a very hot, very dry summer meeting an enormous stretch of naturally flammable forest, is already more than enough to explain everything being observed. So where does this actually leave things heading into the rest of the summer? Canada is currently managing a wildfire season that is technically below average by the main scientific measurement used to rank fire severity, total area burned. And yet that same below-average season has already produced the worst air quality reading of any major city on the planet, forced evacuations across multiple provinces, and numerous First Nations communities, and pushed dangerous smoke across an international border into major American cities within a single week. Government forecasters are explicitly warning that hotter, drier conditions will likely continue through August, particularly across Manitoba, northwestern Ontario, and much of western Canada. Nobody studying this data is claiming this season is guaranteed to reach the extraordinary scale of 2023, which remains Canada's worst fire season on record, or 2025, which also burned dramatically more total land than what's occurred so far in 2026. But here's what should genuinely concern you. 2 record-scale or near-record-scale fire seasons occurring within a 3-year window is exactly the pattern sitting behind why forecasters are treating this year's below-average numbers with real caution instead of relief. The concern isn't that 2026 has already matched those 2 extraordinary years, because by the numbers, it clearly hasn't, at least not yet. The concern is how quickly a below-average season can flip into something far more serious. Once sustained heat and dryness fully settle in, which is exactly what forecasters are describing for the remainder of July and all of August. If you want to actually track whether this season is stabilizing or accelerating over the coming weeks, there are a few specific numbers worth watching. Keep an eye on whether the count of out-of-control fires with full response climbs meaningfully above 60, since that figure reflects fires serious enough to demand dedicated crews rather than simple monitoring. Watch how long any given smoke episode lingers over major cities and how far it travels, because both the duration and the reach of these events have been expanding in recent years, not shrinking. And watch the temperature and drought forecasts specifically for Western Canada, since British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories have already been flagged by federal forecasters as carrying the highest ongoing risk heading into the hottest stretch of summer. Here's the truth this entire season. Keep circling back to. A number on a government spreadsheet can say below average, and somewhere else, at the exact same moment, a city of 3 million people can be breathing the worst air on the planet. A season can look calm from a distance and still force thousands of people out of their homes with almost no warning. That gap between what the statistics say and what people are actually living through on the ground is the real story here, far more than any single number ever could be. And that gap has not closed. If anything, the hottest, driest weeks of the summer are still ahead, not behind us. So if this story mattered to you, if it changed how you'll look at the next orange sky, the next air quality alert, the next headline about a wildfire burning somewhere far away, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with me for what comes next. Because whatever happens across Canada over the next several weeks won't just be a story about forests burning in the distance. It will decide, once again, whose sky turns orange next and who has no choice but to run.